Good evening and welcome to our program with author Helen Epstein. My name is Erin Blankenship and I'm honored to serve as the Florida Holocaust Museum's interim executive director. Before I begin, I want to especially thank Fawn Walker, our outreach and programs manager, for organizing this evening's event, as well as Amy Baruch and David Myers, who are also working behind the scenes to make it successful. After we hear from our presenter tonight, she will answer any questions you might have. So I encourage you to write them in the comments section below this live stream. And also, we're going to ask you to complete a short survey. In those comments, we'll share a link to a survey that'll only take a few moments, and we would greatly appreciate if you would take the time to complete it, because that helps us know whether or not we're doing a great job. We certainly think we are, and it also helps us when we go to apply for grants to fund programs like this and the other amazing programs that we have at the Florida Holocaust Museum. This evening's lecture is the first public program of this season and is held in conjunction with our newest exhibition at the Florida Holocaust Museum. The exhibition is titled Stitching History of the Holocaust, and it comes to us on loan from the Jewish Museum, Milwaukee, and is sponsored locally by the Jewish Federation of Florida's Gulf Coast. So we are very grateful for their partnership on this beautiful exhibition that I hope you'll have a moment to come and see. The exhibition pieces together the story of Paul and Hetty Sternad. Paul had written to his American cousin in 1939, asking him for help for him and his wife to escape Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia. In his letter, he included Hetty's dress designs, and her dresses are included in the exhibition and help tell the couple's story. This evening, we are pleased to welcome Helen Epstein. Helen is an award-winning journalist and author who will be speaking about her mother's book, FRANCI'S WAR. Her work includes the nonfiction trilogy, Children of the Holocaust, Where She Came From, and Long Half-Lives of Love and Trauma. And in 2020, she edited and annotated her mother's 1974 memoir, FRANCI'S WAR. Her pioneering work on the intergenerational transmission of trauma paved the way for hundreds of works by second-generation writers, artists, and researchers. Her reviews and articles have appeared in the Sunday New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, New York, Esquire, and NewYorker.com. And so now, please help me welcome Helen to join us on the screen. Good evening, Helen.
Good evening. Nice to be here with you. Thank you so much, Erin and Fawn, for inviting me to speak in conjunction with your exhibit. My mother, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother were all part of a very special group of Central European women, dressmakers. My mother, Franci Rabinek Epstein, survived as a dressmaker to work in post-war Prague and in New York City. Amy, may I have the first slide, please? This is my mother in about, I'd say, 1955. I broke the three-generation dressmaking tradition in my family to become a journalist, but I grew up with sewing machines and mannequins in the master bedroom of our Manhattan apartment, and my mother's fashion clients having fittings in our living room. Whenever I came home from school, I'd find the customers on the couch, flipping through fabric samples and fashion magazines. Next slide, please, Amy. They included actresses such as Nancy Marchand, who worked as a model in those years before becoming famous as Tony Soprano's mother on The Sopranos. And also, next slide, please, I Love Lucy's neighbor Ethel, in real life, the actress Vivian Vance. My father was unemployed for a decade. He didn't speak any English, and our family depended on my mother's craft, savvy, and her powers of persuasion. Next slide, please, Amy. Making clothing is one of the oldest of women's occupations. This is a painting of women sewing burial shrouds for the Prague Burial Society around 1780. My mother, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother all supported themselves and sometimes their husbands and families by dressmaking. By the end of the 19th century, Jews in Central Europe dominated the entire spectrum of the clothing industry. Amy, can you show us a slide of Central Europe back then? Good. They dominated the entire clothing industry, from peddling old clothes to manufacturing textiles with new machines, to owning department stores in Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. Next slide, please. This is a drawing of an old Central European Jewish peddler. It's not an anti-Semitic caricature. It's actually from a book, an anthropological book about Bohemian village Jews. And this was probably what many of our great-great-grandfathers looked like as they went from village to village. My grandmother, Peppy, was raised by an aunt who ran a used clothing store, another part of this clothing domain that was pretty much run by Jews. She was raised in the small city of Kolín, which is east of Prague. And this aunt taught my grandmother to repair clothes. This is Peppy in Kolín around 1900. Peppy was transformed into a city slicker when she moved to Prague. Next slide, please. She had learned to sew and was doing so well that she talked her way into a job with Moritz Schiller, a fashion emporium close to Wenceslas Square. This is the cover of a magazine that a friend of mine found in an antiquariat in Prague, which shows you that he had enough money to advertise in magazines. Mr. Schiller was familiar with provincial Jews. He taught Peppy how to deal with suppliers and customers, manage a staff, travel to fashion shows in Paris, Vienna, and Berlin, and choose what women in Prague would like. Soon, she became a Prague sophisticate. Next slide, please. Peppy was transformed. She married engineer Emil Rabinek, who encouraged her to leave Schiller and to start her own salon. Salon Weigert was founded in 1920. Could we see the next slide, please? It was making beautiful clothing. And that year, in 1930, that this dress was made, Emil's company went bankrupt. But women continued to buy clothes, and Salon Weigert did very well. My grandfather, who had once regarded my grandmother's business as the indulgence of a feminist woman, was now dependent on the salon's income. He became her bookkeeper. The couple became parents in 1920 when my mother, Franci Rabinek, was born. Next slide, please, Amy. This is a portrait of my grandmother, Peppy, and my mother in a Prague park. I believe that it's 1922 or 1923. She grew up as a privileged child and was schooled at Prague's French Lycée. Next slide, please. A portrait painter was hired to paint her picture, and she was schooled at Prague's French Lycée. But my mother fell in love with fashion and dropped out of school at age 16 to apprentice at Salon Weigert. Every spring and fall, she traveled with her mother to fashion shows in Paris and Berlin. She was in Berlin during the summer of 1936 and so focused on the clothes that she barely noticed the Nazis. She saw herself as a citizen of Czechoslovakia, then the only democracy in Central Europe with a well-equipped army, a liberal government, that was a haven for refugees of Nazism. In February of 1938, she was on a birthday trip in the Austrian Alps. When her worried father cabled her to come home, she stalled because she wanted to attend one last dance. 2 weeks later, Hitler annexed Austria. Amy, please, next slide. This is a photograph of what my mother looked like as the Nazis were annexing one country after another. Thousands of Austrian refugees streamed into Prague after the annexation of Austria. Like the German refugees 5 years earlier, they told stories of beatings, suicides, and arrests. But the vast majority of Czech Jews had faith in their army and in their democracy. When my mother's architect student boyfriend, who was a refugee from Germany, left for America, my mother was brokenhearted, but she did not fear for her life. During that last normal summer of 1938, her salon offered an escape from reality. Then, in September, the Munich Pact allowed Hitler to annex the Sudetenland, the northwestern part of Czechoslovakia. Francie was outraged. She identified as a Czech. She and her parents believed in the army and in their country's military alliance with France and England. They lived in what we would now call a bubble. Her fashion clientele included Jews and non-Jews, one of whom saved the photographs that you are seeing here. Most of them were shocked when the German army arrived in Prague in March of 1939. My mother was then 19 years old. In May came a more personal disaster. A German officer came to the salon to Aryanize it. After figuring out that this was not a business he could easily take over himself, he advised Francie to sell it to an employee who would become the pro forma owner. Marie would now be called Miss Marie and pay my mother a salary. My grandmother, Peppy, was forced into retirement. Francie had no aspirations to become a writer, but as a dressmaker and businesswoman, she was accustomed to paying attention to and remembering detail. Her Holocaust memoir reflects that, and her lifelong observation and work with women is evident in it. FRANCI'S WAR focuses almost entirely on women, beginning with her arrest by the Gestapo in June of 1939. Next slide, please, Amy. My mother wrote, "We were taken to Pankratz prison in June of 1939 and lined up facing the wall with some 50 other people. By midnight, we were led to different cells. I was put in with 2 middle-aged ladies. Marianne Goltz, whom you see on this photograph, had flaming red hair and the self-assurance of an actress, which it turned out she had been. She was also an early Nazi and a Christian who had been married to a Jewish journalist in Vienna. He had fled Austria in March 1938. Mariana had stayed behind in Vienna, obtained a quick divorce on racial grounds, and went to work to help her friends." I'm reading now from my mother's book. She continues, Marianne Goltz smuggled their money and jewelry into Switzerland while carrying on an affair with an SS officer in Vienna. This affair allowed her to cover her tracks and make a fair number of useful connections in the high echelons of the SS in and out of Austria. It had all worked well until the day when the gentleman was transferred. At that point, Marianne decided to move to Prague, where she worked with the Czech resistance and wound up in prison. Marianne gave me an elementary education in the ground rules of German detention. The first rule was never to let your interrogators know anything they did not already know. Never admit anything, she told me, especially not the truth. Never volunteer information, no matter what the promise of reward. Mariana explained the system of confiscation, humiliation, and finally deportations, which had already started in Vienna. She didn't know exactly where these people had been taken, but she tried to convince me to leave Czechoslovakia when I got out of prison. She did convince me that it was foolish for my family to remain in the center of Prague, because our apartment would be confiscated sooner or later. 2 weeks later, I was released. Much later, I would learn that Mariana was beheaded that year. I never learned what happened to my other cellmate. Following Mariana's advice, Francie convinced her parents to move to a small apartment on the outskirts of Prague. And for over a year, Francie biked to her former salon with a shoulder bag covering her Jewish star. In 1940, at the age of 20, she married her boyfriend, Joe Solar. In October of 1941, the first deportations of Jews began. Any of her suppliers, employees, or customers could have reported her to the Gestapo for working illegally, but no one did. The Czech clients, my mother wrote, were a ray of sunshine. They kept Marie aware that I was the reason they were coming to Salon Weigert. They kept up my faith in the human race. Those Czech customers, by the way, are responsible for my being able to show you most of these photographs. They hid them during the war. Life became narrower and narrower for the family. Until the family received transportation slips to Terezin. This is the last photo we have of my grandmother. My mother began her memoir this way. It was a hot day in Prague in the first week of September of 1942, and the industrial palace was teeming with people. I had often come to the industrial palace when I was a child, and my father's firm had a booth. I returned home with free samples and stacks of glossy catalogs. This time, it had been converted to the assembly point for deportation of Jews. I was 22, and I had just had a tonsillectomy. I hadn't eaten for a few days. My mother kept stroking my hair and trying to make me drink water. My father was walking around, hoping to find out what was in store for us. When they told me in the hospital that my parents had been called up for a transport, the nurse said, "We can get you out of this," because of the surgery. I thought it over and then said, "I'm not letting them go alone. They're too old and they don't have anyone else." My mother was 60 and my father was 65. Besides, by September 1942, I was so fed up with all the restrictions on us that I was ready to go everywhere. I'm sorry, I have lost my place. I was ready to go anywhere. I thought that any change of scene would be a relief, no matter what was waiting on the other end. I was always like that, unfortunately. Francie's War is at least the 5th iteration of her experiences during the war. She wrote the first while a prisoner in the Nazi slave labor camp in 1944, where she stole a notebook and kept a diary in the form of letters to her mother. After a guard discovered it, the camp commandant made her burn it, page by page. In New York City in 1955, Francie retold many of her experiences to a psychoanalyst. Then in the 1960s, she told them again to a reparations lawyer for the German government. In 1974, I interviewed her for the American Jewish Committee's collection of Holocaust testimonies in the US. In her book, she refers to herself after Auschwitz as the number A4116. Some readers find this a literary device, but for Francie, it was a psychological defense mechanism. Her description of the process is simple. Her cousin Kitty had left the Terezin ghetto for Auschwitz first. Francie followed her, was quarantined and tattooed. This is how she describes Kitty greeting her. "Why did you come here? Don't you know we're going to be burned? Nobody leaves here alive. The limit is 6 months. Why did you have to come?" I was convinced that she had gone stark raving mad. This was not the social butterfly who always smiled even when she was serious. I stared down at my tattooed arm. It became 2 arms. "Why did you come here?" "Listen to me," said Kitty. "I can see by your face that you don't believe one word I said. I'll show you." Kitty showed her a group of chimneys spewing smoke, and for the first time since her arrival, she became conscious of a peculiar odor in the air. Next slide, please. This is a photo of the 2 cousins shortly after their liberation at Bergen Belsen. In FRANCI'S WAR, my mother wrote about the importance of relationships such as herself and her cousin Kitty, about mutual aid between women, but also about the importance of beauty in the camps. In Auschwitz, she wrote, "My capo happened to be a friend from Terezin, where she had been a cook, and I had made a few clothes for her. She had a solid position in camp, largely because she was exquisitely beautiful, with blue eyes and long blonde hair, and because a criminal German capo was deeply and sincerely in love with her. This way, she was not only able to keep her mother with her and to eat better, but our block also received less harassment than the others." Silva, one of the prettiest girls of Prague, was capo of Block 4. She took her function quite seriously. As her knight and lover, she had Heine, a capo in another part of Auschwitz, who came to Birkenau regularly with deliveries of provisions. He was a criminal from Hamburg, serving a sentence of 99 years for armed robbery. But aside from this disturbing aspect of his personality, he had a heart of gold and was a truly fine human being, one of the best sources of information for the camp, not only in matters of immediate concern, but for news of the war. One of the curiosities of Birkenau was the selection of the capos. All of them were young. The SS preferred to deal with pretty faces and good figures. In July of 1944, Kitty and Francie were 2 of 1,500 Jewish women transported out of Auschwitz-Birkenau to labor camps. They were forced to strip and stand naked for selection by the infamous Dr. Mengele. Here is her description. A4116 watched the proceedings with detached interest, noticing that even young and strong girls with appendectomy scars wound up on the wrong side. By some strange coincidence, everyone had suddenly become a dressmaker, factory worker, or farm worker overnight, and every last housewife had disappeared. When A4116 reached the dashing doctor, he asked her questions: number, age, married, profession. She said she was an electrician. Electrician? Is that true? Yes, my mother said. You know how to pull wires and such? Yes, my mother said. She joined Kitty, who had already made it out, and pulled on her clothes. The other girls crowded around, wanting to know what had caused the change of pace in the proceedings. A4116 explained that the idea of declaring herself an electrician had come to her when she was trying to think of something original to distract Dr. Mengele from the appendectomy scar on her belly. It wasn't an outright lie, since her father was an electrical engineer and had always encouraged her to learn to fix faulty wiring in the apartment. Many others had lied during the long afternoon, especially about their age and occupation. In her memoir, Francie describes the incredible excitement of leaving Auschwitz at the age of 24 with Kitty and with their group of Czech Jewish women on a warm summer day. They were transported in cattle cars. but with open slats so that they were able to see the open countryside. And that experience was followed by the extraordinary experience of arriving in the city of Hamburg. A very strange scene awaited the travelers the next evening when the train stopped at a warehouse in front of a dark row of buildings with huge sliding doors. Those doors and windows were hung like vines with young men, boys of every shape and size, wearing unfamiliar uniforms without insignia, were laughing and shouting at the women, obviously delighted with their arrival. My mother wrote that the ladies were puzzled, then smiled and waved back. There were some initial language problems since they turned out to be Italians, deserters from Mussolini's army or captured partisans who had fought against the fascists. Many of them spoke some French or broken German. On the Czech side, German, French, and rusty Latin had to serve. Francie writes about women's relationships in Hamburg, Auschwitz, and the Terezin ghetto with a non-judgmental attitude that came from her experiences as a dress designer in the salon. This was rare in the 1970s, especially in the context of survivor memoirs. Francie observed all kinds of love in all places, in the camps and in the salon. Love between mothers and daughters, love between sisters and cousins, love between friends, lovers for life or lovers for the moment. She also wrote about love for one's culture and country and love for life itself. Her sexual candor might have been the reason no publisher accepted her memoir, which Francie, by then Franci Epstein, wrote in her 50s in New York City. One of her clients, a well-known literary agent, shopped it around with no luck. But by 2018, the world had caught up with my mother. Books and television shows like Orange is the New Black lifted the curtains on relationships between women in prison. In academia, women's studies and Holocaust studies were delving into the experiences of women in war, and queer historians were sifting through sources for documents of gays. The Me Too movement was providing a vocabulary for an international conversation about the connections between sex and power. As I write in the afterword to FRANCI'S WAR, I decided to edit, document, and annotate her memoir in light of all of those developments. 30 years after my mother's death, I was a mother and a grandmother. I was able to take in what I had been able to take in as a child, adolescent, or even as a younger woman. As a journalist, I knew a good narrative when I read one. And as a reader of women's history, I knew it was unusually rich source material. At first, I thought I'd send my mother's manuscript to an academic press. But much to my surprise, the academics I sent it to urged me to send it to a commercial press. It was snapped up by mainstream publishers in 10 countries. They saw it as a candid, modern Holocaust memoir told by a privileged and glamorous fashion designer who wound up making clothes for some of New York City's most interesting women. Next slide, please. My mother wound up marrying Kurt Epstein, my father, a man who had actually coached her when she went to swimming classes when she was 13 years old and he was 29. And the two of them lived in New York City, where she was the breadwinner of the family. Next slide, please. They left Czechoslovakia, not because of the Nazis, but because of the communist coup in 1948. This photo album photo that you see is from September of 1948 when we've arrived in New York City. Next slide, please. And this is a photo of what she and I both looked like when unbeknownst to me, she was writing FRANCI'S WAR. During these days of widespread racism, political violence, climate change, and the COVID epidemic, Francie's memoir can be read as a survival guide. How did she survive? She kept alert, reading situations and people as best she could, and acting accordingly. She held her friends very close, formed alliances where she could, and volunteered to take care of others, including a young orphan named Gisela, whom she adopted when she met her in Terezin and went with her to Auschwitz. She tried to find meaning in performing work she knew how to do, making and repairing clothing. She did that both as the forced labor that she was assigned to perform, which included repairing German military uniforms, and she did it for favors and for food. But she also risked her life by claiming she was an electrician and showed enormous daring and took great risks when she learned on the job in extraordinarily difficult conditions in a Hamburg work camp. She sought solace in memories of her parents, of her first love, of favorite poems, songs, and music. She took one day at a time and clung to the conviction that she would get through whatever happened. My mother often referred to the concentration camps as her university, where she had received a unique education in human behavior. Her greatest concern was that due to human nature, what had happened to her could happen again in a different form to anyone, anywhere. She left that conviction as a legacy to her 3 children, and I have found it very helpful. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you so much, Helen. I learned so much, and your mother has an amazing, amazing story. I just want to encourage anybody who is watching right now to please leave your comments or your questions below in the comment area on Facebook. And I'll start out with a couple of questions that came up. One is, did your grandmother's or mother's pre-war designs survive the Holocaust?
A couple of them did, and they are in the collection of the Museum of Decorative Arts in Prague. What's really fascinating to me is when I was researching where she came from, a daughter's search for her mother's history, a curator in Prague went into the archives and found advertisements and photographs of these designs. And some of these advertisements include my mother as a child modeling for her mother. So those are very precious to me. And they will all eventually be put online because I'm donating all of my research materials to the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York.
Fabulous. That's amazing. Another question is, while your mother was alive, did she ever speak or tell her story publicly?
Yes, she spoke at various college courses about the Holocaust. She also was interviewed twice as a survivor. Her testimony, her video testimony, is in the Fortunoff archive at Yale University. It's very good. And then I interviewed her very early on in 1974 for the American Jewish Committee. That's an audio interview, and I think it's the worst interview I ever conducted. But so I urge you to look, if you're going to look it up, at the Yale University archive.
Thank you. Given your work in the area of generational trauma, could you tell us what it was like growing up as a child of a Holocaust survivor, especially one with the experience that your mother had?
Well, as you know, Erin, the spectrum of second generation people is so wide. I have friends who are second generation who didn't know they were Jewish until they were 30. And when they found out, their parents refused to say anything about it and forced them to do all the research themselves. I'm at the total opposite end of the spectrum. Both of my parents talked about their pasts. Both of my parents were quite forthright and candid about their experiences. They were very different people, and they had very different experiences. My father had been a lieutenant in the Czechoslovak army before he was sent back to what had been his garrison to transform it into the Terezin ghetto. Terezin had actually been his military garrison. My mother, on the other hand, was this very slick city fashion plate. And the two of them probably would not have met, let alone married, had it not been for the war. But they were part of a very large, tight community of Czech survivors, which included Jews and non-Jews. And they socialized with them all the time. So in addition to hearing my parents' stories, I would eavesdrop and hear all the other stories, which were amazing stories, not only of the camps, but about hiding, about resistance, all kinds of stuff.
Wow, thank you. And I'm sorry. Between the time in which your mother wrote the memoir and tried to get it published and 2020, when you were finally able to do so, could you talk about what happened in between?
Well, my mother, we don't really know when my mother wrote this. We think it was in 1974. She wrote it on a typewriter in English. And because she used a typewriter for her personal correspondence and for some of her business things, she was always typing, and we never particularly noticed that she was typing a memoir. We have not found any previous versions of it, so we think that she just typed it and did a little bit of cutting and pasting. The manuscript has Scotch tape on it. But when it was rejected in 1975, she put it aside and she said to me, look, you're the journalist in the family. Why don't you use it as source material? And I did. I used it as source material for Children of the Holocaust, and I used it as source material for Where She Came From. I wrote Where She Came From in response to my mother's death. My mother died very young. She was 69 years old, and she died of a brain aneurysm. This was back in 1989. And unfortunately, she didn't live to see Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution, which she would have very much enjoyed. And so it's sad. The manuscript sat with my research materials in a file for years. And actually what happened was one day in 2018, quite apart from all of this cultural changes that had happened, I received an email from Marianne Goltz's husband's son. So Marianne Goltz had been the wife of this man's father, and he had become very interested in her, and he had done a lot of research and set up a website. Marianne Goltz has a website, which is quite interesting. And he got in touch with me and said, where did you get your information about Marianne Goltz in this prison in 1939? I didn't know she had been in prison before 1942. This is what happens when you're a writer and people read you all over the world, and you get all of these unbelievable messages. I also was contacted by the relatives of the orphan whom my mother had befriended in Terezin and in Auschwitz. But anyway, Ronnie Goltz was really the one who got me going back to the memoir, because he wanted to know exactly what my mother said. So I sent him the pages from her memoir of her description of her cellmate, Marianne Goltz, in 1939. And in doing that, I got so fascinated by the rest of it that I decided to work on it.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah,
so,
that's the internet.
My next question was going to be, when you went back to research and read her work, whether or not you learned things that she had never shared with you.
Not much, actually, because my mother was an extraordinarily candid mother. And she really treated me as her confidant and as an adult from the time I was a little girl. And she just spilled everything. So I guess what I learned in reading the memoir was context. I learned how unusual she was. And I also learned that my writing skills probably came from her. She's a very good writer. She's a good storyteller. She's got a great eye for detail, great eye for quotes. And she never thought of being a writer because she loved fashion so much. So yeah, that's what I learned. But I think for other people, it is still a pretty stunning story because she talks about relationships between women and women. She talks about relationships between prisoners and guards. She talks about things that were definitely taboo before quite recently.
Wow. Well, it sounds like she was an amazing woman and an amazing writer. Could you also talk a little bit about how you in 2020 was able to publish the memoir?
Yeah, the publisher that published Children of the Holocaust, my very first book, was the publisher that bought this book. And I had a very good agent who sent it all over the world. I myself had sent it to a friend in Prague even before it was sold in English. And much to my amazement, 3 Czech publishers bid on it, and a Slovak publisher was the first one to publish it. A Russian publisher bought it, an Italian publisher bought it, a French publisher bought it, a Portuguese publisher bought it, and now we are working on a German edition that has not yet been finalized, but I'm really hoping that it is, because the publisher that we're interested in is in Hamburg, where my mother was in work camp, and I think that would be a wonderful tribute to her to have it published there.
It truly would. So just as a way of asking one last question, where can people go to purchase Francie's War?
Oh, Francie's War is easily available on any internet channel. You can buy it as an audiobook, you can buy it as an ebook, you can buy it as a print book. If anybody wants a signed copy from me, they can email me. My email is on my website. And actually, I'd like to take the opportunity. I am now writing another book, and I would really appreciate it if all of you would follow me on Facebook, because that helps sell things to publishers. And if you read Francie's War or any of my books, please leave a review on Amazon.
Perfect. So we will gladly share the link to your website here in the comments. And again, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your mother's story with us, and of course, a bit of yourself. So thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you, Erin. It was my pleasure.
And it's ours too. So thank you to all of you who viewed this program this evening. Again, I want to encourage you to check out Helen's website, which we'll leave in the comments below. And please head over to the survey. You'll see a QR code on the slide that'll appear right after I'm done speaking. And you can use that to go to that survey. It'll take you just a couple of minutes to share your thoughts about this program and help us do our jobs even better. So thank you very much for tuning in. And we hope to see you next week, next Wednesday, for another program commemorating the massacre at Babi Yar. So please tune into that on the 29th. Thanks so much and have a good evening.